Imagine a place that would one day become one of the most powerful countries in the world. A country with a president, a constitution, and a government chosen by its people. But centuries ago, this same land was not an independent country at all. There was no United States. Instead, along the eastern coast of North America, small settlements were slowly growing under the control of the British Empire. These settlements were known as colonies. During the early 17th century, English settlers began establishing permanent communities in North America. In 1607, Jamestown was founded in Virginia. It became one of the first permanent English settlements in North America. Over the following decades, more settlements appeared. People came for many different reasons. Some were searching for land and wealth. Others wanted religious freedom. Some hoped to find better opportunities for themselves and their families. And others came because they believed the new land offered a chance to build a different kind of life. Slowly, the number of English colonies increased. Eventually, 13 major British colonies developed along the eastern coast of North America. These colonies were separated by distance, geography, and local traditions. But they had something very important in common. They were all connected to the British Empire. They were not independent countries. They were part of a much larger empire ruled from across the Atlantic Ocean. At the center of that empire was the British Crown. The king was the symbolic head of the entire empire. But how could a king sitting thousands of miles away actually control distant colonies? The answer was not as simple as the king personally making every decision. Instead, Britain created a system of governors, local assemblies, officials, and laws. Some colonies were directly controlled by the crown. In these colonies, the governor could be appointed by the king. The governor represented British authority and was responsible for protecting British interests. But the colonies also developed their own local governments. This meant that life in the colonies was not simply a dictatorship controlled directly from London. People had some political power of their own. Local assemblies could discuss taxes, laws, and other matters affecting their communities. However, their powers had limits. The British government still believed that the colonies were part of the British Empire. And because they were part of the empire, Britain believed it had the right to regulate them. For many years, this system worked reasonably well. The people living in the colonies often considered themselves British subjects. They spoke English. They followed many British traditions. They recognized the authority of the British Crown. And they generally accepted their connection to Britain. But something was slowly changing. The people of the colonies were living thousands of miles away from Britain. Their daily lives were different. Their local problems were different. Their economy was developing in its own way. And over time, they began developing an identity that was different from the people living in Britain itself. For the moment, however, most colonists still saw themselves as part of the British world. They did not yet know that this relationship would eventually lead to revolution. And they certainly did not know that the colonies would one day become the United States of America. The British Crown was powerful, but ruling the American colonies from London was not easy. The Atlantic Ocean separated Britain from North America by thousands of miles. A message could take weeks to cross the ocean. A decision made in London could take a long time to reach a colony. Because of this distance, Britain needed people on the ground to represent royal authority. That was one of the main purposes of the colonial governors. A governor could oversee the administration of a colony. He could work with local officials, enforce British policies, and protect the interests of the crown. But governors were not completely independent. They had to work with colonial assemblies and local political leaders. These assemblies were an important part of colonial life. In many colonies, local representatives were elected by certain groups of settlers. They could debate local laws and taxes. They could influence how money was spent. And they gave colonists a voice in their own communities. So the colonies had a strange political system. On one side was the authority of the British Crown. On the other side were local institutions that gave colonists a certain degree of self-government. For many years, these two sides existed together. The colonists could manage many local affairs while still recognizing the authority of the British Empire. But there was always an important question. Where exactly did the power of the local governments end? And where did the power of Britain begin? As long as everyone was willing to compromise, the system could continue. But eventually, the balance became more difficult to maintain. The British government believed that the colonies existed within the empire and therefore had responsibilities toward Britain. The colonists increasingly believed that they had traditional British rights that should be protected. They wanted to have a voice in decisions that affected their lives. This difference became especially important when Britain began demanding more money from the colonies. Britain had spent enormous amounts of money fighting wars. The 7 Years' War had been extremely expensive. British leaders believed that the colonies had benefited from British military protection. Therefore, they believed the colonists should help pay for the costs of the empire. Taxes became one of the biggest sources of tension. From the British point of view, asking the colonies to contribute financially seemed reasonable. But many colonists saw the issue differently. They asked a simple question. If Britain was going to tax us, who was representing us in the British Parliament? The colonies had local assemblies, but they did not elect representatives to sit directly in the British Parliament in London. This created a growing political argument. The colonists began saying that taxation without proper representation was unfair. At first, most colonists were not demanding complete independence. They were still proud of their British heritage. Many simply wanted their traditional rights to be respected. But the argument was becoming more serious. And then a new king came to the British throne. His name was George III. His reign would become closely connected with the growing conflict between Britain and the American colonies. In 1760, George III became King of Great Britain. During his reign, the relationship between Britain and the American colonies became increasingly difficult. The problem was not simply that the king personally wanted to control the colonies. The larger issue was the structure of the British Empire itself. British leaders believed that Parliament had authority over the empire. They believed that laws passed in London could apply to the colonies. But many colonists disagreed. They believed their own elected assemblies should have greater authority over their internal affairs. The argument became especially intense when Britain introduced new taxes and regulations. One famous example was the Stamp Act of 1765. The law placed a tax on printed materials such as newspapers, legal documents, and other papers. Many colonists strongly opposed it. Protests spread through the colonies. People began organizing against British policies. British goods were boycotted. Political groups became more active. And the phrase, "no taxation without representation," became a powerful expression of colonial anger. The British government tried to maintain its authority. But every new confrontation made the relationship more fragile. The problem was becoming larger than taxation. It was now about political power. Who had the right to make laws for the colonies? Could Parliament in London make laws for people who had no elected representatives there? Or did the colonists have the right to govern themselves? These questions divided communities. Some colonists remained loyal to Britain. They believed the crown was legitimate and that the empire could still protect their interests. Others became increasingly convinced that Britain would never respect their political rights. Then came one of the most famous events in colonial history: the Boston Tea Party. In 1773, colonial protesters opposed British control over the tea trade and taxation. They boarded ships in Boston Harbor and threw large quantities of tea into the water. It was a dramatic act of protest. The British government viewed it as a serious challenge to royal authority. Britain responded with harsh measures. the relationship became even more hostile. Colonial leaders began communicating with one another. They organized meetings and discussed how the colonies should respond. The idea of united resistance was becoming stronger. But even at this point, independence was not yet guaranteed. There were still people who hoped that Britain and the colonies could reach an agreement. Many colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects. They wanted their rights protected. They wanted their local governments respected. They wanted Britain to change its policies. But the possibility of reconciliation was becoming smaller every year. The conflict had now reached a dangerous stage. The British government wanted obedience. The colonial resistance wanted greater political freedom. And neither side seemed willing to completely surrender its position. Soon, protest would turn into armed conflict. And the question would no longer be whether the colonies could remain comfortably inside the British Empire. The question would become much bigger. Could they become independent? By the 1770s, the relationship between Britain and the American colonies had changed dramatically. What had once been a distant political disagreement had become a major crisis. British troops were sent to enforce authority. Colonists organized resistance. Tensions continued to rise. Then, in 1775, fighting broke out between British forces and colonial militia at Lexington and Concord. The American Revolution had begun. The colonies were now fighting against the empire they had once been a part of. But independence was still a difficult idea. Many colonists had spent their entire lives thinking of themselves as British subjects. Their parents had been British subjects. Their communities followed British traditions. The king had once been seen as the legitimate ruler of their world. Now, they were being asked to reject that authority completely. As the war continued, support for independence grew. Political leaders began arguing that the colonies should no longer remain under British rule. And in 1776, the colonies took a historic step. The Declaration of Independence was adopted. It announced that the colonies considered themselves free and independent states. The relationship with the British Crown was being broken. The 13 colonies were no longer simply asking for better treatment within the empire. They were claiming the right to govern themselves. The American Revolution continued for several years. Eventually, British forces were defeated, and Britain recognized the independence of the United States. A new country had emerged. The people who had once lived under the British Crown were now creating their own political system. There would be no king ruling the new nation. Instead, the United States would develop a republican form of government. Looking back, the American Revolution may seem inevitable. But it was not. For generations, the colonies had lived under British authority. They had traded with Britain. They had followed British laws. They had respected the crown. They had considered themselves part of the British world. The change happened slowly. It began with questions about taxes. Then came arguments about representation. Then came disagreements over Parliament's authority. Then protests. Then punishments. Then violence. And finally, revolution. The story of the early American colonies is therefore not simply a story about a king controlling distant land. It is a story about how political power can change over time. At first, the colonists wanted to remain part of the British Empire while protecting what they believed were their traditional rights. But as the conflict continued, more and more people began to believe that true political freedom required something greater: independence. The colonies that had once looked across the Atlantic toward the British Crown would eventually look inward and begin building a new nation of their own. And that is how 13 British colonies slowly moved from being subjects of a distant king to becoming the United States of America.